Check rolling. Okay. Hey, it's Trey. I'm in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, one of the state's two oldest towns. It's located in the history-rich Lower Shenandoah Valley in West Virginia's eastern panhandle. And it's near several important sites of the Civil War. But I'm here at Shepherd University to learn more about a different war, the war that created the United States of America, the American Revolution. I'm moderating a panel discussion with three history scholars before a live audience. We will watch excerpts from The American Revolution, the upcoming PBS series by award-winning documentary filmmaker Ken Burns. In preparing for this event, I realize what many of us know about the Revolution are simply the highlights, or what Jennifer Murray, a professor and director of Shepherd University's Civil War Center, calls the narrative of greatest hits.
The Declaration of Independence, kind of the keynote features, Benedict Arnold, Saratoga, Yorktown. I don't remember it being a particular focus, actually, of my education.
Was it meaningful to you back then?
I wouldn't say so, but I didn't have a particular interest in history at the time either, so.
So what about now? Is it meaningful to you now?
Yeah, certainly more so now.
Why?
Yeah, because it's timely. It's the 250th anniversary of the birth of our nation. It speaks to us as who we are as a country and a democracy and the exceptionalism of our people.
She's talking about the 250th anniversary next year of the Declaration of Independence of 1776. Bruce Deal is also at the event. He lives in Shepherdstown. He says as a kid, he learned about the famous Beeline March of 1775, when about 100 local riflemen marched from Shepherdstown to Boston, covering 600 miles in about 24 days. It was a remarkable feat at the time. They came to help the Continental Army drive the British from Boston.
And the British, of course, didn't like these people because they had rifles instead of muskets. They could shoot a much longer distance, and they didn't stand up in a line. They liked to stand behind it by a tree, but they did this not to hide, but because it was such a long rifle, they needed a brace. And they tended to shoot the people that were most colorful, which tended to be the officers. The British didn't really like that.
I've got three people here. First of all, can you all tell me who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, so I'm Jessie. I'm from W.Va, West Virginia.
What is it that you remember being taught about the American Revolution when you were in school?
That there was lots of fighting in the streets, the redcoats are coming, that there's the Boston Tea Party and a bunch of tea was dumped into the boat. I'm trying to take it back to fourth grade.
And I'm Tamar. What I remember about the American Revolution was the Boston Tea Party and Paul Revere, and that just the taxation without representation, and that we had to fight England to have our independence.
What about you?
I'm Kathy from Middle Way, and what I remember is the Tea Party, and our fourth grade teacher, as she taught it, she actually brought us tea, and we had a tea party in the classroom with biscuits and unsweetened tea.
The story of the founding of the United States of America is full of legendary stories like the Boston Tea Party and the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and the selfless service of George Washington, the father of our country. But it's also a violent story of vicious battles that created many different divisions. Not only did the Revolution pit patriots against the British, but colonists fought one another over whether to revolt or stay loyal to King George III, ruler of Great Britain. It was also a battle of ideas over who gets to participate in a representative democracy. The Declaration of Independence declared all men are created equal, but there was a heated debate over whether their government should treat them as such. As we'll find out, there's more we can learn about our nation today by reconsidering our student notions of the story of the American Revolution. From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them, the show that tells the stories about the things that divide us and bring us together. I'm Trey Kay. The new PBS series, The American Revolution, took 8 years to make, about as long as the revolution itself. It was directed and produced by Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, and David Schmidt, and written by Jeffrey C. Ward. It premieres on PBS and on West Virginia Public Broadcasting starting November 16th. The 6-part, 12-hour documentary explores how 13 separate, rival British colonies rose together in rebellion, won independence, and built a form of government based on ideals of self-determination and equality that have inspired and challenged us to this day. Here's Ken Burns talking about the American Revolution on CBS's Face the Nation in July.
I think the American Revolution is the most important event since the birth of Christ in all of world history. It turned the world upside down, which is the cliche. Before this moment, everyone was a subject, essentially under the rule of somebody else. We had created in this moment a very brand new thing called a citizen. And this has had powerful effects. It's going to set in motion revolutions for the next 2+ centuries all around the world.
West Virginia Public Broadcasting recently hosted a screening of excerpts from the documentary at the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education at Shepherd University. Copyright restrictions prevent us from using that material here. However, our live event included a wide-ranging conversation with 3 experts on the War of Independence. Dr. Raymond Smock is the Director Emeritus of the Robert C. Byrd Center and the former historian of the United States House of Representatives. Dr. Benjamin Bankhurst is an Associate Professor of History and Director of the Center for Appalachian Studies at Shepherd University. And Dr. Friederike Baer is an early American historian at Penn State Abington. She's the author of Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. Dr. Baer also appears in Ken Burns' documentary. Dr. Bankhurst, I'd like to start with you. And with a nod to this place, Shepherdstown, its residents played a significant role in the early days of the Revolution. Back then, Shepherdstown was part of the colony of Virginia. Local riflemen made a fast march to Boston, covering 600 miles in about 25 days, to join General Washington's army during the siege of Boston. What was significant about what's known as the Beeline March?
It's the formation. It's a moment of the formation of the Continental Army beyond just the New England militia units. So in 1775, the Continental Congress takes over responsibility for the units that are outside of Boston, and there's an acknowledgement that this new Continental Army needs to expand beyond just that regional core. And so the 2 units raised in the Shenandoah Valley represent that move. One raised here within the vicinity of Shepherdstown under Hugh Stevenson, and another under Daniel Morgan in the vicinity of Winchester.
In the American Revolution's opening sequence, it mentions a bitter irony. Benjamin Franklin's famous call to the colonies to join or die was inspired by a long-standing confederacy of Native American tribes called the help me pronounce it, Haudenosaunee. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. I've been practicing it all day, and I still mess it up. The Haudenosaunee, and yet the formation of these colonies into the United States accelerated an end to that Native American confederacy and moved tribes off of their ancestral land. So my question to you is, how did historians previously explain that, and how do scholars understand that now?
Well, I think the indigenous contribution to the concept of republicanism in North America I think we're only really beginning to appreciate that over the last 20 or 30 years. Prior, I think the emphasis has always been on European roots, or perhaps 17th century roots for English republicanism as a concept. But I think one of the things we'd like to do, perhaps as a panel over the course of this evening, is to remember that we know the end of the American Revolution, but the participants certainly did not, and that's certainly true for the native peoples of Eastern North America. the native peoples of the Ohio Valley have to make a choice. Are they going to side with the British, or are they going to side with these colonists? And that choice will have immense consequences for what comes next.
Friederike, I just want to stick a little bit on the Haudenosaunee. How was that confederacy formed, and how did it operate?
It's essentially several Native American tribes that band together in a confederacy that we would describe as a confederacy with shared interests, shared governance, and I think in the introductory remarks referring to it as a democracy. Our
colonial founders, I mean, they were informed by that. Can you amplify on that?
I think one aspect that they're certainly noticing is that by uniting these different communities, there's power. It gives them tremendous power within, amongst the other powers, including imperial powers in North America. And by them, I mean the Iroquois Confederacy. And the British and the colonists are very aware of that.
I want to bring in Dr. Raymond Smock to this conversation. Dr. Smock, you were a former historian of the House of Representatives. The First and Second Continental Congress influenced the formation of the House and Senate, but the Continental Congress was structured very differently. Can you just give me a general outline about how it operated and what were the big issues that they were focusing on at that time?
Well, the Confederate period, our first government under the Articles of Confederation, the first government is the one that fought the war. But most scholars, when they look back on it, they say, what a mess this thing was. It was a government that really didn't work because none of the colonies wanted to give up any particular power. They couldn't figure out tax laws. They couldn't figure out all kinds of other things. But they were successful in getting the war, even though George Washington was complaining all the time. This is when the government was just a Congress. There was no presidency. There was no Supreme Court. There was just a Congress. And that government lasted until we formed the Constitution in 1787, and which was ratified and passed and became our government in 1789. Mm-hmm. But in that period, they couldn't hardly agree about anything, and everything was done in secret. When they sent Ben Franklin to France, nobody knew that he was gone. But this same crazy government got us through the Revolution, and they did some amazing things. There's some documents that come out of this era, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which carved out what would be the future states in the Midwest, and provided in all of those states, when they carved up the states, that education would be important and that land would be set aside for educational purposes. So they were thinking ahead, and they also knew, and they talked about this, that our democracy was not going to work unless the citizens were educated.
Right. I think we even hear that with, yeah. That's actually something I refer to in my journalism all over and over again, is that what is it, Jefferson, who says if we don't have an informed electorate, I'm paraphrasing him, but this whole enterprise is not going to work. But I want to understand, what did the delegates in the First Continental Congress, to the best of your knowledge, what did they think of Ben Franklin's join or die movement? What did they think of that?
Well, this is still a controversy among historians about how big an effect the Albany plan, that was based on the Confederation, the Indian Confederation, how important that was. It was a noble idea, perhaps, as Franklin put it together, and as the delegates that came to Albany, they all said, this is a good idea, we ought to do this. But then they had to face the politics of each of the colonies. So I think the Confederation period was a flop. And everybody realized that, and that's why they were supposed to, when they went to Philadelphia to draft the Constitution, they weren't supposed to draft the Constitution. They were supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation so that the Articles would work better. But they basically abandoned the Articles and created this new government of the Constitution.
Dr. Friederike Baer.
Well, one point I think is also important to keep in mind is that under the Articles of Confederation, you already mentioned there's Congress, there's no president. Congress is very weak. Mm-hmm. and the equal representation by the states are equally represented. And I think that also indicates that there was tremendous suspicion of giving up power, giving up state power in particular. So, and then unanimous vote required for everything they were basically going to do. So any amendment required that all 13 colonies or 12 had to agree. So it was paralyzing, essentially. Yeah. But I think that it's a war measure. It's like we have to get together. We have to be able to make foreign treaties, for example. There are certain powers that Congress has. But the states are not willing to really give up much power.
Nothing concentrates the attention of these various state governments like the presence of an invading army, right? So
yes.
I think...
Okay.
That's right.
Dr. Baer, the film stresses the involvement of more than 24 nations, including professional soldiers from multiple German-speaking states. Germany wasn't unified yet. How did the presence of these foreign actors change the conduct of the war?
Well, first of all, we have to look at the American Revolutionary War as a global war. Yeah. I think that's something that many people don't really recognize. It's fought, but not exclusively in North America, but it involves nation states from around the world. We have, of course, nations that are directly involved in the conflict. Spain, for example, France, you mentioned the so-called Hessians, about 30,000 or so of them fight on the British side. We also have powers that are involved in different ways. The Netherlands, for example, Russia, even through a declaration of neutrality is in a sense getting involved. And then we have wars that spill out in obviously the Caribbean, right. England, South Asia, ultimately even South Africa after the war.
Dr. Bankhurst, the documentary describes the American Revolution as a savage civil war. Describe the divisions between the people living in the 13 colonies at that time.
John Adams famously said after the war, he's trying to make sense of it all. And that generation spent the rest of their lives trying to make sense of this conflict. And one of the things he remembered was that roughly the American population was divided into thirds, he argued. The thirds were what he would refer to as hot patriots, those who supported independence. He called the second third, I think I'm paraphrasing here, something along the lines of vile Tories, who are those who supported the crown throughout, were committed to that cause. And then the final third, who were just wanted the quiet life and would go with whoever happened to be in power at the time. Now, the current consensus is that is off, that perhaps anywhere from 10 to 15% of the population would have remained loyal to the crown throughout. And so something to be remembered, I think, about the War of American Independence is that it's a long war. And it's not as easy as an us versus them conflict. It's not just plucky Americans fighting off a foreign invader. It's also a war of ideas fought between Americans. In that sense, I think the accomplishment of American independence, if I could put on my patriotic hat here, is even more spectacular, right? Because it's won in that sort of context. And the Shenandoah Valley is a divided space too. It's an ethnically divided space, and within months of the Beeline March, James Morgan, a Continental Army soldier, is home on furlough, and he's murdered by a loyalist gang outside of Martinsburg and bayoneted to his cold house door. To this day, the area around that cabin is referred to as Torytown, so it's not as if this area wasn't in the midst of a civil war as well.
And, I'm going to foreshadow a little bit. In our pre-event talk, I asked Dr. Baer, just some of her general remarks of this and what are the takeaways of this documentary by Ken Burns. You want to go ahead and say what you said? Because I think it kind of relates.
What did I say?
You said that, well, let me tell you what you said. What you said is that I think that people who come to watch this documentary, and it kind of goes a little bit to some of the questions I was asking folks, like, what do you remember in history class? And there's kind of the general things, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and the Tea Party and all that stuff. And what you said was that I think people are going to be shocked at the depiction of violence.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is a war that is romanticized. First of all, I don't know how you all learned about the American Revolutionary War, but I grew up in Germany, but went to undergraduate and graduate in the United States. And When I learned about the American Revolution at the time, it was very much about the ideological origins of the revolution, which is really important, of course. We're founding a republic. It's radical in many ways. But the war was almost like there was also a war going on. There was much attention paid to it. And it was not until much later that I really began to realize this is not just a long war, but it is really a violent war. All wars, you could argue, are violent. But I think because of the Civil War nature of the conflict, and then also because of the terrain and the background and the frontier violence that you see in this in North America. I mean, when you read primary sources talking about it, it's truly horrific what people witnessed and experienced.
Could I add one other element to this? The other aspect of violence in this war was a smallpox epidemic that was wiping out soldiers much more so than in battle. The British soldiers, when they came over, European experience and also inoculations there, they were getting it less. And finally, I was just watching on television today these hearings about vaccines. George Washington decided that his whole army needed to be inoculated against smallpox. And of course, that inoculation meant you were getting smallpox, and you hoped you didn't die from it when you got the inoculation. And some did, but most didn't. But he made that after losing so many people, not only from battle, but from disease. He decided to inoculate the army. And you could argue that decision, that bold decision on Washington's part, saved his army from dying of disease.
While General Washington was fighting to win the war, delegates of the Second Continental Congress were trying to form a union among 13 rival colonies. One of them, Pennsylvania, was considering the radical idea of allowing common people the right to vote.
So there's tremendous suspicion that Pennsylvania is creating a government that is giving people the power that you can't really trust with power.
Coming up, the debate over who gets to be an American citizen. You're listening to Us and Them. This show is supported in part by the CRC Foundation and W.E.T.A. in Arlington, Virginia.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
Hey, it's Trey, and you're listening to Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Ken Burns, the acclaimed PBS filmmaker behind many historical series like the Civil War, baseball, jazz, and Vietnam, has created a new documentary called The American Revolution. This 6-part series begins on November 16th on PBS stations, including West Virginia Public Broadcasting. It's released this fall, and next year's celebrations for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence provide an opportunity for Americans to reflect on this exceptional and deeply consequential moment in history. Let's return to the recent event at Shepherd University in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, for more of our conversation with historians Dr. Raymond Smock, Dr. Benjamin Bankhurst, and Dr. Friederike Baer. Delegates of the Continental Congress were multitasking in ways that must have been overwhelming. They were fighting a war, and they were working on Articles of Confederation that would bind 13 rival colonies together while guaranteeing independence in each. So, Dr. Ray Smock, what were the roses and the thorns of the Articles of Confederation? Like, what do the delegates get right, and where do they miss the mark?
The big mark that they missed was not having any unified way to pay for the war. Each of the colonies was reluctant to tax And so you had to raise money in all kinds of different ways. One of the people who was called the financier of the American Revolution, Robert Morris, gave a personal fortune to help with the revolution and ended up, for various reasons, in debtor's prison. George Washington visited him in debtor's prison at the end of the war. So when they said they giving their fortunes, their lives, and their sacred honor, some of them did give their fortunes.
So what did they get right?
What did they get right? They got right some of these ideas they were planning for the end of the war. They were planning for development of the country. They saw the country expanding into the Midwest, what we call the Midwest, Ohio country they called it. It was one place, and that became Indiana, Illinois, right. Ohio, and so in that sense, they were visionaries.
So, Dr. Friederike Baer, at the same time the Continental Congress was hashing out the Articles, at that same time, and in the Pennsylvania State House, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was drafting its own government just upstairs in the same building. And it included principles that made John Adams and several other delegates blanch. It had a Bill of Rights, and it allowed nearly any free white man to vote and stand for office.
The Pennsylvania State Constitution was a radical document. It did not have a single executive. It had an executive council, and it most importantly was unicameral. There was basically no checks and balances.
So what does unicameral mean?
There's no upper and lower house, for example, no House and Senate, anything like that. It is one legislature.
Okay.
And it is a fairly large legislature, and elections were annually.
Okay.
So the idea really is we're going to give essentially these tax-paying or property-owning white men as much influence as possible. It's sometimes what's called the democratization of the legislatures. What we're beginning to see is people are getting elected into these bodies, like in Pennsylvania, that a few years earlier there would have been no way. They probably would not have even been able to vote. Farmers from the backcountry or tradesmen, the leaders, the political leaders of these communities, of the states, of the nation need to be wise men, gentlemen, essentially the intellectual elite. So there's tremendous suspicion that Pennsylvania is creating a government that is giving people the power that you can't really trust with power. It's really seen as being a dangerous experiment, and it fails. I mean, it doesn't. This constitution is not going to be in place for very long.
And you mentioned John Adams. We hear part of the correspondence between Abigail Adams and John Adams, and she's urging the delegates to remember the ladies and not give all of the political power to their husbands. Did her husband or any delegate give that any consideration?
Well, they quote a letter from Adams right afterwards, where he basically said, no, if we get power to ladies, then next will be the young lads and all these other people that are presumably not fit.
Besides letters, how did colonial women participate in the nation-building debates of the day?
I think that in these communities, in the revolutionary communities, there's certainly people talk to each other. There's socializing. There's markets, a public sphere, so to speak, in which women contribute informally.
Regarding women's participation too, there's a famous British cartoon about the boycotts before the war, in which the British cartoonist is lampooning the Americans because of how much these women are participating in the boycotts, feel like they have a stake in them. So they're also market actors, right, in the lead up to the conflict.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. They knit stockings. I mean, seriously, they do fundraising. They collect, lead from households to melt to make into bullets. Women are really contributing to the war effort in many different ways. I mean, it's not really contributing maybe to the ideological debates, but they're necessary. They're active participants in the war.
We would really like to get some audience questions, so if somebody would maybe step up to the microphone. Could you just tell us who you are, where you're from, and just ask a question?
Steve Pearson. I'm from Shepherdstown, from here. At the beginning of the presentation, you talked about the context of this being multiple nations, countries participating in this, and the context of a global conflict. And obviously, the leaders of at least on the American side, had experienced fighting in the war, the British versus the French, from a few years earlier. How much of this notion of this war, this republic created on these ideals was based on we have these ideals and we want them, and how much was it possibly, there's this opportunity, because these bigger powers are fighting here, we can create this space for us and we can use these sort of ideals as a way to unify us, but what we really want is this sort of economic independence?
That's a fantastic question.
Well, can I jump in on that one? These aren't ideas that 18th century Americans came up with on the fly in the midst of revolution. They're looking back to British history. They're looking back to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 89 and the Charter of Rights that comes out of that conflict. And these are people, I think we must remember this, who do not have a sense of a continental identity in 1776. If you think about the British Empire as it existed before the war, each of these colonies, the empire is like a wheel, right? In the center of the wheel is London, and the spokes are the connections that each colony might have to London or to the Caribbean, but not to each other, right? I mean, it's remarkable if you go to the 1760s. In Pennsylvania, for instance, one of my favorite... It's weird to have a favorite election from the colonial period, but I do. My favorite election of the colonial period is the Pennsylvania election of 1764, in which one party, roughly tied to the Scots-Irish of the colony, is labeled the Presbyterian Party, and you have Benjamin Franklin saying you can't trust Presbyterians. They don't believe in they don't believe in monarchy. Then he refers to them as dreadful Republicans, right? And he didn't mean that in a good way, small r. It's remarkable how quickly this transformation comes in many respects. But I guess the short answer to your question is I think it's a means of resistance in some way.
Well, what I'm thinking as we talk about this is, when did we become Americans? Was it in the Revolution? When did we quit thinking of ourselves as British? And this whole history gets compressed. And, you got to go back to the French are out in what we later called Louisiana Purchase out there. The Spanish had a whole empire from Mexico all the way around to Florida 60, 70, 80 years before the Pilgrims landed in 1620. There's this long period of history, colonial history, where you're separated from your main powers. And that separation, I think, is what is the origins of where Americans, and finally, by the Revolution, they needed to take it over.
I have a quick question. You talked about other countries involved in the war and it was global. What's going on in Canada?
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll come to that. We're big proponents of putting Canada back into this story.
Yes,
so I think
historians in the last few years have really been paying more attention to Canada. Right. It was always a little bit of a sideshow, and the Americans invaded early on. They tried to wanted it to be the 14th colony essentially, and that doesn't work out. Britain successfully, very famously, is repelling them. It remains British, even after the war, obviously. Mm-hmm. Thousands of British and also German troops spent the entire war there. Mm-hmm. Many do not participate in any major campaigns after Saratoga. Yeah. There's always the fear that the Americans will invade again, try again, and there's preparation, but it doesn't really happen. Yeah. So it's not an active theater of war after Saratoga.
Okay. So, panel, let's talk about George Washington, a towering figure in American history, a Virginia farmer, a slave owner, commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and the first president of the United States of America, the father of our nation. He's portrayed as heroic, a stalwart figure in countless paintings and monuments, but during the war, he faced criticism, low morale among his troops, and a lack of provisions. Washington and Quartermaster General Nathan Greene turned that around by getting the colonies to send animals, muskets, and supplies to the Army's encampment in Valley Forge. How did this supply chain change the interior of the colonies?
A lot of this was actually resented among the communities making the supply. So each state was obligated to provide certain quotas, and this was mandated by Congress towards the war effort. Many of them had problems really doing this or meeting the quotas for the effort. But what is remarkable, I think, is the degree to which a country that didn't really have much in the way of intercolonial or interstate infrastructure is able to harness all of these resources and get them from point A to point B. And I think that, in many respects, is Green's genius.
Dr. Friederike Baer.
This is Valley Forge, where this is all taking place. And when the Americans are there, that is exactly the time that Philadelphia is occupied by the British. And the countryside, including the area around Valley Forge, had been largely stripped of resources by the time the Americans get there, which is late in the year, into winter quarters in 1977. So you mentioned morale. I think it's very important that Washington is able to put someone in control to get these people and animals fed.
While General Greene helped feed and supply Washington's hungry troops at Valley Forge, Baron von Steuben, a Prussian immigrant and military leader, transformed those troops into a more effective fighting force. Well, let's talk about Baron von Steuben.
Oh, yeah.
He's a recent arrival to America. He was a lieutenant general in the Prussian army, a close aide to Frederick the Great, and a stickler to details. What was he up against as he trained the American troops?
First of all, much of what we know about his story, he told us, so we have to be a little suspicious. I mean, we know that he was a baron and he was in the Prussian army, but it's a little unclear exactly what his background was. I believe he went to Benjamin Franklin in Paris first and offered his services, and Franklin was not impressed and was like, Anyway, but he does, I think it is February, arrive at Valley Forge and is welcomed. And what he's up against is, from his perspective, for someone who was in the Prussian army, who fought in European wars, who had that experience, is basically like this untrained hodgepodge of people are committed to the cause, but pretty much lack formal training. So he's trying to train them. Drilling is the big thing. Drill. I always thought it was interesting that the American army, in a way, is trying to become a little bit more European, while the European army is trying to become a little bit more American in this war, and they're both realizing that maybe they both need to move. They cannot do what they thought they can do at the outset.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that. Sure. Let's compare the army in 1775. We've been talking about the Beeline March, for instance. They're famously, or infamously, there's a huge snowball fight on the outskirts of Boston between the different units in this Continental Army, and Washington has to go into the fray and separate people, and it's very clear that there's a sectarian's the wrong word, but kind of rivalries between the different units from different colonies. They take this childish game and it turns into a fist fight, right? This is an unruly group at the beginning, and I think that the story here, the Valley Forge Winter, is that we're moving away from that to that sort of professional unitary army.
So, the final major conflict of the American Revolutionary War was Yorktown. American and French forces under General Washington and General Rochambeau decisively beat the British and Hessian forces under the command of General Lord Cornwallis. Dr. Smock, Cornwallis didn't attend the surrender. He sent a deputy who offered Cornwallis' sword to Washington, who insisted that Rochambeau take it to acknowledge France's help. Is there a message for the U.S. today in that gesture from Washington?
I don't know what the gesture is for now. It was an important thing at the time that it happened, because the formality of the surrender, it was important to notice that the head guy was not there to give his sword. I'm not sure what, maybe the other panelists have an idea of how that reflects in our current situation.
I'm just eager to talk about Canada again whenever you're ready.
Well, one thing that it is also, I think, hard for us sometimes to understand is the nature of warfare and the honor of war and the rituals of war were really so different back then. Yeah. It's very ritualistic, the way an army surrenders, and then basically all the generals go out for dinner. And the prisoners of war, the officers particularly, are all on parole. It's really a different world in some respects.
Does the great man theory apply to George Washington?
If we're going to have a great man theory, it's going to have to be George Washington for sure. And I agree with what the film said that, maybe we shouldn't emphasize great men. But George Washington was indispensable. He was a formal presence. When I worked on all the size and shapes and everything of all the people that were at the convention, the Constitution Convention that's in the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, I worked on all those statues. Nobody knew how tall George Washington was until he died and they measured him for a coffin. He was about 6'4". He was always a head taller than almost anybody in the room, even though other people in those days were tall. He had a military bearing. He was a fantastic horseman. He was an athlete. The person that we got to be the body model for George Washington at the National Constitution Center was a 55-year-old retired New York fireman who was in good shape physically, but had a little bit of a pot belly. And that's sort of what George Washington looked like. But his presence was, he was a formal person, and nobody joked with him. Nobody patted him on the back. And nobody went up and gave him an elbow. He was separate from others, and there was an aura about him. And when he was on a horse, he was just an incredible presence. So that's just the physical thing that people saw at the time. And his presence has stayed with us throughout our history. We look at the dollar bill. I'm going to just mention this briefly, and maybe you can try this with some kids sometime. George Washington is on the dollar bill, our smallest bill. But look what's on the back of that bill. It's the story of the American Revolution. It's the idea of the American Revolution. It's these Latin words, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the ages. And Annus Septis, God or Providence, smiles on our endeavor in this revolution. So your $1 bill is actually a nice little American Revolution story that you can tell. And try that on some kids sometime. I think they'll have some fun with it.
I think his legacy is also, of course, very much shaped by what happens after the war. The fact that he takes off his uniform and returns to his quote-unquote farm and does not become a tyrant or a dictator or takes advantage of being the war-winning general like Napoleon or others would later do. And then, of course, he leaves retirement or gets out of retirement to accept the request to become the first president of the United States, and in his mind very selflessly serving the new nation for 2 terms. So I think that too really has shaped his legacy, and I think it's hard to separate what he did after the war from what he did during the war.
Dr. Bankhurst, Yorktown reads like an ending, but on the frontier in Appalachia, the violence continues for some time. Why didn't the surrender at Yorktown end the hostilities in the backcountry?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's partially because the European struggle for empire at the center of the continent is not over. And the British are very keen to not relinquish control of the Great Lakes region, for instance, and the forts up there. So I think that goes to explain it to some degree. There's also questions of native sovereignty in the West, so that you have indigenous actors who don't want to see this end the way it looks like it's going to end, because it's not going to end well for them.
So as we're moving to a close here, I've got a question for our panel, but I'd like to have 3 people who maybe could come up to the microphone. 3 people, because I want to ask a question to our audience. So if I'd have 3 volunteers who could make their way up. But my question to our panel is I'd like each of you to comment on the scholar Rick Atkinson's comment at the beginning of the documentary that the American Revolution is our creation myth. And some people, at least in the work that I've done for the past 20-some years, bristle at the term myth. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Okay, I'll go first. Yes, I think that using the term creation myth makes it sound like whatever happened was not what really happened. And what came out of this revolution is not a myth. It was the new order for the ages. It was the idea of the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And eventually that phrase applies to women, it applies to everybody, and we're still unfolding that story. I don't call that a myth. I call that an essential part of the story of the revolution and the story of our history. We had an origin that most countries didn't have in quite the same way. We overthrew a king, and this was in an age where there were kings and emperors, and in Japan there were shoguns, and we created this new thing. There's nothing mythological about that. That's powerful.
Mm-hmm. As a scholar of the American Revolution, I took a very roundabout turn to get here into West Virginia. I did my graduate work in England, where they have a very different take on the American Revolution. And I remember when we talk about it in the classroom with my students over there, it dawned on me in the midst of one of our conversations that in a way, the United States styles itself as a new nation. But if you're taking this question of creation myths, in a way we're older than the English, because their memory of the Second World War serves the current generation as this moment of national self-definition. And it's true that the revolution serves the same. So going back to an earlier question you asked about whether or not we should take this history warts and all, and why people have such difficulty hearing the truth about the revolution, is because we're so invested in it, principally because our roots as a nation are, I suppose, ideological and tied to the Republican experiment. So,
Federica?
Yeah, I think the choice of words is interesting, myth,
Mm-hmm.
because it does suggest like there's something really made up about it,
right.
Or fantastic. I don't. But at the same time, when you again going a few decades past the revolution, almost immediately we have writers, poets, historians who are writing histories of the American people and the American nation, and they're really trying to create that story, and in some cases myth. I mean, most famously, many of you probably know George Washington Cannot Tell a Lie,
right.
The Cherry Tree. It was a biography published, I think, 1800, something like that, by Parson Weems, and it's like super popular. And there is mythology mixed in this national origin story. So in that regard, I think it's a well-chosen term.
Right.
After hearing final thoughts from our panelists, I want to ask questions of our audience. I asked 3 people to come forward, and the first to the microphone is a young man. So to you, I want to ask, what part of this history feels most alive in this region today?
I think the idea of resistance and self-reliance, especially in this area, the idea that we still do see ourselves as separate in some ways, and that we rely on our small communities to take care of each other rather than an overarching federal presence, especially here in West Virginia.
Okay, to you, I'd like to know, how can we use this 250th anniversary of America's founding, not just to commemorate, but to recommit to the work of a republic?
I think it comes down to reflection more than anything else. And that's the value of programs like this, and the value of the history field is most so that we can look at where we have come from. We can look at these examples from people. We can read the letters of soldiers and individuals from years past. And we can really kind of look within ourselves so that we're not necessarily committing to what everyone as a whole is kind of going towards. We're not kind of just following a crowd, but more so that we're finding the values within us that we can most relate to, and then utilize those going forward to be a better citizenry.
Excellent. How do we balance those who want a heroic origin story with those who insist that we show our founding with all of its warts and blemishes?
Yeah, both. We want both. I think you have to have a hero to follow, and just like George Washington, to have someone who's going to bring out the best in people. But I think you have to question every decision that a leader makes, really push it, think if it's going to really benefit the people around you and yourself. One of the things I was thinking about was the troops. They're mostly just common people, and they've been rallied to fight behind something, and the elite have convinced them to come and join this effort. And what were they going to do? Like, what was the benefit for them to do that? And so they had to have a leader, and they had to have some kind of common thread of why they were showing up to literally risk their lives, and to what benefit at the end. Like, what were they promised? And so what were they really fighting for? And so I think, even though they didn't have necessarily the representation at the time, I think even then they were really questioning still the leadership. And that's why I think, Washington had to start organizing everybody and really getting them behind why they were fighting.
So, audience, there's so much more to explore when West Virginia Public Broadcasting airs The American Revolution beginning on November 16th. We hope that you'll watch it and that you'll keep this conversation going. I'd like to give thanks to my panel, Dr. Raymond Smock, Benjamin Bankhurst, and Friederike Baer. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming, and good night.
2, 3, 4.
You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this show was me, Trey Kay, Amy Eddings, and Kate Smith. Thanks to Zach Doherty and Patrick Fuller at the Robert C. Byrd Center, my colleagues Janet Kunicki, Liz McCormick, and Americo Valdez at West Virginia Public Broadcasting, and Chloe Kuzius and Amy Lebensky at WETA in Arlington, Virginia. Special thanks to A.R. Banks and James Welsh of Welsh Sound for audio production and recording of the Shepherdstown event. And personal thanks to Jerry Bach and Bruce Massey for hosting me while in Shepherdstown. Michael Lipton, Tristan Lozow, and Ahmed Solomon wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the CRC Foundation, and WETA. Hey, we'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Would you share them with us on our Facebook page or on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Us Them Podcast? Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
From PRX.